And now it's Deborah Kobylt Live.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on Deborah Kobylt Live. And we are joined by Dr. Connie McReynolds, licensed psychologist, who wrote this terrific book, Solving the ADHD Riddle, the real cause and lasting solutions to your child's struggle to learn. And there is so much talk. In fact, we've had various people on our show recently to talk about ADHD because back in the day when so many people were diagnosed with ADD, ADHD, very often the issue was, oh, take a pill for it. Because, pretty much a lot of teachers and some parents just wanted to quiet a kid down. But the spectrum of ADHD is so wide. So first of all, thank you for joining us. And secondly, can you explain to us the real cause, as in your title, of ADHD?
Well, first, Deborah, thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to our great conversation. And I think you've raised really a very interesting point of this, because what I've come to learn over the last 15 years, and I've been doing neurofeedback, I know we'll talk about that, but really looking at this idea, if you will, or the story or the narrative about ADHD for the past 15 years. My background comes from rehabilitation counseling and psychology, which really is about looking at people's strengths and identifying areas of limitation and creating workarounds. So I've been doing that for a good 30 years now. And when I started encountering this, when I built the clinics at this university in Southern California 15 years ago, one of the first things that I started noticing is that parents were coming in and they had a similar theme. We've been down all these roads. We've tried these medications. We've tried these behavioral interventions. Nothing seems to be working, or there's side effects, or nothing seems to last. And my child is still struggling at home. Everyone's frustrated, struggling at school. The teachers are frustrated. And so with the assessment that I identified as part of, it's not mine, I didn't create it, but we did learn how to use it very effectively. What we were starting to see is that underneath whatever the diagnostic label was, in about 85 to 90% of the people that I worked with in my clinics, they had these auditory and visual processing problems. And when we were able to identify those problems and then institute the brain training processes that we have used over these years, those problems started going away because the children started functioning better. So if a child can't remember, here's a great example. If a parent says, I talk to my child, they seem to listen, they turn around and seem to forget everything I've just said to them. It's so frustrating. I can say this over and over and over, and it doesn't seem to make any difference. They still don't follow through. One of the telltale signs for auditory processing problems. When we find that with this 20-minute computer-based assessment, then we can literally train the brain in those areas, like strengthening a muscle, like going to the gym. If I'm weaker in my left arm than I am my right, I go to the gym, I practice lifting weights with my left arm, I strengthen that, then it's better. The good news about neurofeedback is I don't have to keep going back to the gym for this one.
I love that.
Whereas for my left arm, I have to keep going, right? I have to keep it strengthened. But when we're training the brain, the beauty of the brain is this concept called neuroplasticity, which neuro means brain, plasticity means change. And what we know through all of science about how the brain learns is through repetition. And by identifying these areas, then we are really able to train the brain, and people don't need to keep coming back to the brain gym, if you will.
So explain to me what that is through repetition. Like, explain exactly how it works for people who are like, oh, it sounds interesting, but what is she talking about? Go ahead.
Yes. So we use this process called EEG biofeedback. Most people have heard the term biofeedback. And that really began when scientists and health professionals and therapists learned that you could place a sensor on a finger and measure pulse and respiration, and that by guiding someone through relaxation processes, they could reduce their levels of anxiety, they could affect their pulse rate, their respiration rate, and they felt better. And so that was the beginning of called biological information and feedback. That obviously got shortened to biofeedback. So fast forward a few years to neurofeedback, which is the brain. We're able to use sensors that measure brain waves and activity in the brain that's fed into a computer. And through the use of scientifically designed training programs that look a little bit like video games, we set up a training plan for a person. Like you go to the gym, you work with a trainer, they set up a training plan. We do the same, usually 20-minute, 30-minute sessions twice a week is what most people do. We do 20 of those sessions, and then we come back and we reassess to see and measure for progress. And with that, people, children and adults, are able to learn better control of how their brain functions. And by strengthening it through repetition, that's how the brain remembers everything it's supposed to do. How we remember how to talk, walk, write, whatever we've done has been through the process of repetition. We used to call it practice. So if you want to be good at the piano, you have to practice piano. And what you're doing is training your brain. So your brain can remember, and you just automatically know then how to play a song after you've practiced it enough, because it's been recorded and wired in, so to speak, to your brain. And so the brain holds it. And you may not remember the song all those many years later, but a greater example of this is learning how to ride a bike. And so as a child, we can learn how to ride a bike. We cannot be on a bike for literally decades, and we can get back on that bike and we can remember how to ride and stay upright. We don't start all over with training wheels again, typically. We get back on the bike and we can ride. And so that's the power of how the brain gets wired. And I also joke with people, it's also why those bad habits are hard to break because they're hardwired in.
Are there any early signs? You know, generally, I know someone who said their baby, for example, showed signs of stress, perhaps too much information was coming in and just was always crying. You know, a lot of people call it colic, but there's a lot of different reasons for colic. Can you actually identify something like this very early in the brain in an infant? If you could answer that. And then also, why don't you answer that first?
Okay. Okay. Well, I don't work with infants per se, but the youngest we have worked with is 3. And so, and there are, I think, perhaps groups that would work with smaller children. We're just not geared for that because they have to interact with the computer. So we have a more interactive process for people. But parents will say, you know, the 3-year-old, obviously the parents had already identified something going on with the 3-year-old. That's like, okay, he can't follow. He's constant movement. We can't get him to follow through with anything. He's bumping into things, knocking things over. And, you know, it was disruptive to the family, not because the child was wanting to be. And that's a really important point here. These children are not wanting to be disruptive. They're not wanting to be problems. They're not wanting to be in trouble. But what's happening is the brain just isn't able to process what is coming at them at the level of what is expected, regardless of the age. So there's an expectation of a certain level of performance as we move through society. The older we get, there's greater expectations of us. So what we have found is that when we identify and can kind of break out which areas are working okay and which areas aren't, we can literally create that training plan that's unique to each person. And through the repetition of that training plan, which again look like they're training programs, we just call them video games, that children can learn and adults can learn how to retrain that so that they then find themselves better able to absorb the information. Maybe they're not as sensitive to sounds or visual cues in society. Children oftentimes are really distracted by sounds. Some children, to understand this, if children have some auditory vigilance problems or prudence problems, then what that means is they're easily distracted by other sounds around them. And so, for example, if a child's in a classroom and there's noise outside the classroom, there's noise in the hallway, a child's tapping his foot, another child's shuffling papers. For children who have this auditory and visual processing problem, everything comes in at the same level in their attention. So they cannot discern between the child who's tapping his pencil or whatever and what the teacher is saying at the front of the room. Everything's coming in at the same level of attention, which means there's a lot of distractibility in the brain. The same with visual processing. So some children are really distracted by visual movements around them. So if they're trying to focus on the teacher at the front of the room, at the back of the room, and every kid in the room's moving, then their brain is doing the same thing, only with visual, which means everything is coming in at the same level of interest or attention. So they cannot separate out what they're not supposed to be paying attention to or what they are supposed to be paying attention to. And so herein lies a lot of disorganization, a lot of frustration. They look like they're not, quote, paying attention. And it's not that they're not trying to. This is not willful bad behavior. This is about the brain and how the brain is just taking everything in all at once and doesn't have an effective filter to say, oh, I need to hone in on what the teacher or my parent is saying to me or showing me right now. They can't make that discernment, in other words.
What about physical activity? Kids with ADHD, are they able to perform certain physical tasks? I've read that, sometimes they can feel uncoordinated. Could you talk to us about that?
Well, there is that tendency for some children. I'm kind of careful because I don't want to lump everyone in. I can have 10 children
Right.
walk in a day into my clinic, and they're all 10 going to look unique and different with what they're struggling with and what the parents and teachers are struggling with. But for a child, if they have the visual processing, and one of the way it's manifesting is that they can't quite keep track. They're tripping over things, bumping into things, dropping things, shuffling things, disorganized. They can't organize their backpack. You look in the backpack and you're going, oh my gosh, how do you find anything in here? You go into the room. How do you find your bed? This room is such a mess, kind of thing. How do you find your shoes? You don't know where they are. So the key to all of this is, what are the behaviors that you are observing in your child? Is there something here that seems like maybe it's a little bit not where it needs to be? So is this a clue that there could be a processing challenge going on with this child? And that's really where it starts. Parents are very observant, typically speaking. They kind of know if there's something that just doesn't quite seem like it's where they want it to be or it needs to be. And so what could that be? Well, it could be auditory processing, or it could be visual processing, or a combination of both.
You talked about video games. Like, can you walk us through a little bit about, some of the rehabilitation that you do with kids? Would you?
Sure. So what we were looking at when we do the assessment, so I do the assessment on everyone. It takes about a half an hour to get at this information. And then those areas of weakness. So as I was just describing, let's say it's a child who doesn't matter how many times someone tells him or her to do something, they don't seem like they can hang on to it very well. So that's some type of a memory problem that's probably being affected by either the prudence, the distractibility, or the inability to attend. Those are two different things. So sorting out what it really is, then we build this training plan that's about 30 minutes in length. And we use a matrix of training programs that we select from that are specifically designed to tackle certain areas of brain processing. So if it's a working memory problem, then we're going to choose something in the category of that. You think of it like appetizers, main dish, desserts, or whatever on a menu. This is like a matrix of different kinds of training programs. And there are certain options that we have in the system that we can select from. And by creating this training plan, they're usually about 2 to 3 minutes in length. And then we switch it up. And I want to speak a little bit because people are, I think, becoming more and more sensitive about video games and exposure.
Right.
And we all need to be having that conversation much more deeply. These are considered low impact and they're short term. So there's not anything in this system that's going to do what we call kind of a dopamine dump, which is what these high impact, first shooter, first responder, first whatever, the violent ones are the worst, in my opinion, about what that's doing to children's brains. And in my opinion, is backed up by a lot of scientific research on this, by the way, which I do mention in the book. So what we want to do is really use the benefit of the computer, the benefit of being able to measure brain waves and feed that into the computer. There's an algorithm that's matching things up. And so if I'm inattentive and I'm trying to run a program or participate in a program that's designed to build my attention, it's going to measure how well am I doing. And how well I'm doing depends on then whether I'm able to win that program or that game. And so the more my brain is able to manufacture the brain waves that represent attention in this particular area, then the more I'm going to win that game. And so as my brain gets stronger, these programs naturally move up in difficulty so that we're continuing to stretch and train and grow the brain in this area, which then is reinforcing the change, strengthening it. And when we get to the end of the plans, then we're able to measure the progress. And typically people do quite well and go on. And we love our clients, but I always say, I want you to do well and go live your life. So come in, do this, and go live your life and have a great one.
Generally, how long does a person go through therapy for ADHD and work with you?
I can only speak for us and what we're doing. So typically we do 2 sets of 10 hours of training. I would say the majority of people get that done. So people come in either 2 or 3 times a week for their 30-minute sessions. And then the industry standard is about 20 hours. I will say that some people are faster responders, other people are slower responders, and it doesn't depend necessarily on age. It depends on how far we need to go. So based on the assessment, it's like if we have children who have some real deep gaps in processing, we're going to be building some of that. And so that could take a little longer than the person who already has a lot of this in place, but it just isn't strong enough to be an asset to them. So if we're dealing with partial processing there, we strengthen that. That person probably will wrap up a little sooner. We've had children who come in who have zeros all the way across on both auditory and visual processing, where they're not picking up on anything. And so these children are going to be there a little while, but I've yet to fail. So I will say we have succeeded with every child who has come in. Thankfully, it's a minority of the people we see, because having children who are struggling like that, they are not going to do well in any kind of academic setting at all, because they can't remember auditory information and they can't remember visual information. And so they appear as if they are cognitively or developmentally or intellectually delayed, and they tend to get channeled into services that may not be the best match for them. Because if you can't remember, it doesn't matter what the service intervention is, you can't remember what's being presented to you. And so the key to that is you have to fix that. Sorry.
What are some of the symptoms? No, please. What are some of the symptoms? Especially as the kid gets older, right? If they're into middle school and high school, they can get depressed. They talk back. They're not handing in their assignments, or even worse. Can you talk to us about some of those symptoms? Because a lot of times kids go through school and they sort of fake it as though they're okay. And I've seen that. Could you talk to us about that, please? What some of the symptoms around this could be?
Sure. I think that's a really great question, because one of the things I think is really important for parents to understand is that up through the end of grade 3, children are learning how to read. And so between 3 and 4 is the break point here. And so if a child has not mastered and is on grade level by the end of 3rd grade, when they move into 4th grade, they're now reading to learn. This is a completely different setup. And this is why we end up with a lot of 10, 11, and 12-year-olds showing up in my clinics, because the parents will say, well, they were doing great up until 4th or 5th grade, and then everything started falling apart. And then we do this assessment, and sure enough, we have these processing problems that turn out to be an impediment to being able to read, process, comprehend information. So they went from looking like they were doing really great in elementary school to kind of falling apart. The longer this goes, the more they're falling apart. And so by the time these children get to high school, if they've gone through 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, wherever that is, and they have just continued to kind of either slide through and not be identified, which happens a lot with girls, because girls will hide out. They don't want to be identified, and they will sit back, they will be quiet. Boys have a little bit better chance if they're overly active or frustrated or behaving out, because we'll see them. Someone will see them and start asking questions or having difficulties. But not always the case. We have quiet boys who actually don't act out either. So that's not a hard line in the demarcation, but it is important to really look at the academic struggle. The thing that I think is difficult for parents and teachers, and I come from a long line of teachers. I taught for 25 years in a university setting. My mother taught for 32 years in the same classroom in 2nd grade. My aunt was the dean of a college of education, and I had aunts and uncles that were teachers and professors. So I get teaching. So as I'm sitting here saying this, I get teaching. I know what it's like. to be over there. But I
I
will
know.
say we miss
Go ahead.
things.
Mm. So when you miss things, what happens? I know a couple of kids because I remember when I was raising my children, all the talk was ADD, which is what it was called then, ADHD, because some kids were hyper, some kids were not. And to be honest with you, that always confused me. I'm like, wait, isn't it one of these things where kids are hyper? So actually answer that first. Is that true or not true? Because you don't have to be hyperactive, right, to have ADHD. Is that true?
You do not. And it's
Yeah.
I kind of have started calling myself a myth buster because there are a lot of myths around this. And one of them is it's only for the child who runs around and can't sit still that has ADHD. That is absolutely not the truth. I think we did a
Yeah.
little disservice when we combined ADD and ADHD together because
Yeah.
ADD is really about the inattentiveness. And so that gets lost now, I think, in the conversation. So I think we've lost an entire segment of children being on people's radar because now they think inattentiveness is not ADHD. They just think it's willful bad behavior in a lot of cases, and it isn't. That is not what this is at all. So what we're dealing with is really, this concept of hyperactivity can be a lot of different things. And in the assessment that we run, we actually have a way to look at something called fine motor hyperactivity, which, as I've come to understand it, is more of a quiet hyperactivity that exists in the brain. And it serves as static, but the person doesn't know it's static. In other words, it's interfering with the person's ability to process information. So kind of like white noise in the background. If you've always had that, you don't know what it's like to not have that until it's gone.
Yeah.
But we can find it
wow.
with the assessment. And when we find it with the assessment, that is the first thing that we will tackle is really calming that part of the brain down and strengthening the pathways so that that goes away. And we can get rid of those symptoms.
What about for kids? Again, when our kids were going through school, this was all the talk. And I remember medication was actually being passed around in libraries, which completely freaked me out because then every kid will get on that bandwagon saying, I have this, I need to take a pill. And I was completely, really very concerned about that. Right. But, and I remember so many children were on Adderall and other drugs to sort of tamper this ADHD going on in their heads, which was not even diagnosed at the time. Right. What do you say to kids who sort of passed through the whole system and ended up taking medicine and perhaps are in their 20s now and are still taking medicine? Is there hope for them? Can they go and get an assessment and train their brains?
So we offer telehealth services. So I can really work with a lot of folks with this service. And what we have found is that the medication, I think it can have its place. So I'm not anti. However, I think we need to broaden our horizons a little bit on how we want to tackle this, because I think it's more than just taking a medication to get rid of this. The medication doesn't actually go at the underlying causal condition, in other words, to resolve it. It doesn't resolve the underlying, it just gets rid of the behavior. It's kind of a Band-Aid, if you will. So what parents will say is, yes, we put them on, it wears off by mid-afternoon, and by the time they get home, they're a holy terror, and we can't keep giving them more and more of this to deal with this. And that's kind of what happens to a lot of families. Some folks do quite well on the medications. It's just the ticket for them, works well, they have no complaints whatsoever. A lot of people have complaints, and a lot of people are experiencing side effects. And I'm always at the root cause. That's my heart and soul. Goes back to rehab counseling, which is let's get this worked around. Let's find this solution. And it goes back to my mother and how she operated for 32 years in her classroom as well. And I'm solutions oriented and focused. And when I'm talking solutions, it's not just the Band-Aid. It's like, let's really tackle this from the ground up. Let's find out what the root cause is. And let's deal with that, because what I found over these years is that we actually can deal with it, and people can go on and do better. And some children get off, and adults get off of the medication. Some of them take less, typically speaking.
But they can, all older children, and who are now adults actually, they can actually go through methods to train the brain. In other words, it's not too late to ever train your brain, because we can do that as adults, right? I mean, in my day, this wasn't even talked about. It's like, oh, they're hyper. Oh, go outside and kick a ball. something like that. I know in my case, when I was younger, I wasn't necessarily bouncing off the walls, but I always needed information coming in. And
Yes.
my mom put me into figure skating, and that I was hyper focused about my skating, which is very good for me, right?
Right.
So I think back in those days, people were looking for something to do with a kid that always had their mind racing. I know physical activity can be very good for people
Yes.
and adults too. So I guess my
Yeah.
question is, what can one do if they're an adult, whether it's my age, whether you're 30, or in between?
Well, we've worked with people, as I said, as young as 3, and we've worked with people as old as 93. I
Oh,
kind of
wow.
chuckle a little bit because the 3-year-old and the 93-year-old, we did need to both teach them how to use a mouse because neither one of them knew how to use the mouse.
That's very funny.
Yeah, oh my gosh, they used to meet in the hallway and shake hands. It was quite adorable. But
Wow,
we've worked with people,
93.
yes, 93, because seniors want to retain their cognitive functionings for as long as they can. And this is a great tool for that. There have been some really, really good research longitudinal studies on seniors that came out of the University of Florida several years back, really good studies that really show that this can really help people. If you're not in that category, though, I've worked with people who actually have these attention, memory, focus, concentration problems as adulthood, whether or not it's called ADHD or anxiety. Could be trauma-based as well. There can be a lot of causes for this. But the good news is that neuroplasticity, we always come back to that because the brain's capable of changing. And we have completely busted that myth that once you hit a certain age, it's a downhill slide from there. That's not true, thankfully.
Good.
It doesn't have to be that way. And so neurofeedback, the program that we use, works very well for people of all ages. And we've actually done some job saves for folks who were in trouble.
Oh, wow.
It's really kind of in jeopardy of losing their jobs because they weren't able to pay attention. They couldn't follow through. I had a gentleman who was in his 50s who found us and came in and said he was in jeopardy of losing yet another job because he just couldn't remember what his boss was telling him to do. And his boss was getting really frustrated with him. And we ran the assessment, and lo and behold, we found that he had some pretty significant auditory processing and memory problems. And when I gave that information to him at the time of the intake, he broke down. And he said he always thought it was because he was just stupid. He couldn't remember anything, and he was blaming himself and saying he wasn't smart enough to be able to hold on to a job. I said, this has nothing to do with that. This has nothing to do with your intelligence. And that's one of the most important things that adults and children and parents and teachers can really understand. This isn't about intellectual capabilities. It's about the fact the brain just can't process certain types of information and hang on to it. And it's kind of hard for people to first identify it and then be able to be consistent enough to retrain the brain. It's possible, but we're kind of the life hack is what I call us. We're your life hack here. So we can come in and with about 10 or 20 hours of dedicated intervention with this, if you want to call it that, it's brain training, it's what I call it. We can help people strengthen those areas. And then they go on to do much better. So they can remember what the boss is saying. And the boss isn't mad at me so much anymore today. I'm feeling better about myself. Children's self-esteem and self-confidence and self-compassion start to rise when we figure this out, and they can stop the negative self-talk that happens with a lot of folks who struggle in this regard. People use a lot of negative terminology toward themselves and can be very harsh toward themselves. Others can be harsh too. And that's really what we want to stop. There's no need for that. It doesn't make anything any better. It's not going to help the person, and punishment does not work for children who have auditory and visual processing problems, attention, focus, memory. Punishment doesn't work. So pulling out the electronics and saying you can't have this I'm all in favor of cutting off all electronics until children are 16. No social media until the age of 16. I don't think anyone under those ages should be involved in any of that. There's too much harmful activity going on with it. And then video games they seriously need to be limited because you're training your kid's brain based on what they're watching. Remember, every time they're exposed to something, the repetition of it, it's hardwiring it in. And so I waxed just for a second into the dopamine dump that some of these games do. And we've treated children for video addiction that is so severe that when the parents started pulling back on the amount of time this child was doing this, he destroyed his father's work computer. He wrecked the house. They literally had to pull in some services, wraparound services, to try and stabilize this young teenager. Yeah, I think he was 12 at the time. And we worked with him and did what we could, but they couldn't get him off the video games, and he became so destructive that it became a really big problem for this family. Not everyone's to that level, but we want to be mindful so we don't get to that level.
That really breaks my heart hearing that. It really does, because I think parents are trying to do all they can, and sometimes they're pulling their hair out and they don't know what to do. They just want the kid to feel okay. And that's, I'm glad that you were able to help this person, because that really could have led down a road that really wasn't very, very good for that kid and that family. Wow.
Right.
Talk to me about some famous people. I sometimes look at, all the people in the past, and I mean people who are no longer alive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so many of them probably had ADHD, right? Undiagnosed. And I actually think sometimes it makes a person so colorful. They're so bright. There's so much going on in their lives, right? Do you know of any that you could list for us, or that you believe probably had ADHD?
Well, I wouldn't be able to do that because I'd be diagnosing without meeting them, and that's kind of a foreboding thing as a psychologist.
Very true. Very true.
So I can't really diagnose. But what I can say is, people talk about ADHD superpowers. This doesn't change any of that. So people won't get help sometimes because they think they're going to lose the benefits that they've identified in this, their creativity. It does not change your creativity. It simply gives you more of what you're already good at, because it gets rid of the drag. So imagine that you're going down the river, you've got a boat, you've got, a 50-pound weight that you're pulling behind you, and you've got your boat in overdrive, but you are still experiencing drag because you can't really do all the things that you're probably capable of doing. Even though you have a really speedy boat, you have a lot going for you and things are looking great. You get rid of the weight to get rid of that drag, and you're going to fly. You're going to do even more than what you've been able to with less effort. So imagine being even more successful and not having to work as hard to get there. You have more opportunity for creativity. You have more energy even to do the wonderful things that you're wanting to do in life. It just gets better.
Getting to your book, Solving the ADHD Riddle. I mean, I can't obviously go through a lot of it here, but I want to encourage people to pick it up, because, you go through how does the brain learn, the significance of auditory and visual processing issues, because even I didn't know either. I'm like, oh, wait, what's the difference? Can you have both? Can you have one without the other? So you go through a lot of that. Tips for parents, how the brain wiring works, just a lot of terrific information that, we're not naturally born knowing. Any of that you want to address briefly before we, let you go?
Okay, sure. Well, I do think that it provides parents and teachers with an opportunity to read about some of the children that we've worked with, so that you can see the stories of what was their life like, prior to this, what brought them to the clinic, what was the struggle. We deal with a lot of trauma, and I haven't talked too much about that. I work with a lot of veterans. We have a VA contract here in Southern California to work with veterans who have anxiety, depression, trauma, PTSD, ADHD. So we're able to really modify some of these brain responses, in particular with trauma and anxiety and that whole spectrum of the anxiety diagnostic criteria. The brain has become overly activated in the survival, the fight, flight, or freeze aspect. And when that gets tripped into the on and it stays on, that's what we call hypervigilant. People are hypersensitive to things that are coming their way. They're prone to overreact at times. They don't know even why they're overreacting. They often feel badly about it afterwards, but they don't have any way to catch it before it happens, and then they're kind of left cleaning up afterwards. And so I actually have published on my work with veterans and my work on ADHD in professional journals before I wrote the book about the ADHD. But the neurofeedback in these interventions, what's so important is to recognize that if it's a brain process, we really can probably help strengthen up some of those areas. Trauma, we deal with children who've come through foster care or been, part of domestic violence. We deal with adults and some of the other really tough traumatic events that can happen to people. And trauma can happen whether it's a kind of a one-time situation or a long-time repeated situation. We have seen the long-time repeated situation globally over the last 4 years, where people were literally traumatized almost day in and day out with fear about the pandemic. There was isolation, anxiety skyrocketed. We're still digging out. We're going to continue digging out from that for quite some time. We're dealing with a lot of teenagers who have a lot of anxiety, social anxiety. And I do know that there are a host of young children who came up during the mask process that haven't learned how to speak and form their words properly. So a lot of speech and language therapists are finding their offices are filled now with these younger children who are needing help because people's faces were covered. And so we learn how to speak by watching some people. And when the mouth was covered during those time frames, we have children that have very little exposure to how you formulate words properly. And so they lost a lot of that. So that's a category that was completely unexpected and has burgeoned in the last year or two. And certainly our caseload for children and adults who come out of that with anxiety and trauma, some part of what we call chronic PTSD or complex PTSD is because of repeated injury to kind of not physical injury, but just the psychological and emotional injury that triggers that part of the amygdala system. And with neurofeedback, what we can do is train that part of the brain to calm down again. And I used to tell the veterans when we started working with them, it's like the off switch got lost when you went into the military. And we just have to reinstall that off switch so that that part of your brain knows it's okay to come back down toward the floor instead of living at the ceiling all the time, 24/7. You don't want that at 24/7 all the time at the ceiling. You need, if there's an incident, you need to be able to respond. And then you need that to come back down so that you're not living in that heightened, hypervigilant, distressed, stressful place.
Generally, do you have parents on the same page about this? Because I know that it can break families apart. One parent said, maybe we should handle it like this, or another parent saying, no, it's okay, it'll pass. Do you run into that often, or generally you're able to get everybody on the same page, particularly now that more people know about ADHD and what it is? But it can really tear people apart and families, can't it?
It really can, because there's a big struggle within the family. One parent will think it's just willful bad behavior. The other parent may have a different approach and say, I think there's a problem here that we need to address. So by the time they usually get to my clinics, they've kind of worked it out because someone won the battle to get in the door. And so whoever that parent was that won the battle, they're there now. And what can happen is once I do that assessment and we have hardcore data, then the reluctant parent has less to argue and push back against, because the parent who won the battle now has data. And so that parent can say, oh, but look at this 15-page report of how your son is struggling. And yes, we are going to do something about this, and you're going to get on board.
This has been a terrific conversation. How can people get in touch with you, who I know you're in Southern California, but for those people who perhaps wanted to do telehealth with you, could you let people know how they can get in touch?
Yes, thank you. So you can find me up on my website, which is my name, Connie McReynolds, ConnieMcReynolds.com. Up there, you can take a free brief assessment on that website. So if you just kind of want to dip your toe into the pool, so to speak, you can download that free brief assessment and see, okay, is my child falling in either of these categories? The book is up there. You can download the book. There's the first 3 chapters if you sign up for the newsletter. And I promise I don't flood your email with copious issues of the newsletter, but it does give you a chance to get the first 3 chapters to see if this kind of feels like something that's resonating with you. There's a contact me form there as well. I do ask people to include their phone number and an email address. I do respond within about 24 hours of those contact me's. I will get something scheduled with you. If you're stateside, within California, we usually do a phone call, or close to this area, we can do a phone call. If it's a little bit different from that, we can schedule a Zoom call, and those are free consultations. So I do about 15 to 20 minutes with you to just answer questions, see if there's something that this might work for you. We can do the initial intake via Zoom or in person, whichever way tends to work. And then there are ways that we can work with people beyond the state of California.
Wonderful. Dr. Connie McReynolds, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a really, honestly, interesting and enlightening conversation, because I still think enough people don't quite know about really what is ADHD. How can we really help a child? How can we help a teenager and an adult? Because nobody really wants to continue living like this with a clouded mind that's always crowded with information and not knowing where to go with it. I've seen it perpetuate, in young adults. And I just think this is something that's really important, just sort of to free us all, to be able to take in information and have a place for it. So thank you very much. And please, people, pick up Solving the ADHD Riddle. It's a terrific read, easy to read. I was thumbing through it before I read it, and then I found it to be very interesting, because, as I said, this has touched our own family. It's touched me. So, I would venture to say that it's touched most people, and maybe you didn't even know it. So I'm sure that the book is available on your website, right? Yes. In addition to Amazon and anywhere else that you get your books. So please pick that up and reach out to Dr. Connie McReynolds. Thank you again so much for joining us. And our conversation can be found on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and then, of course, as an audio version, iHeartRadio, on Apple Podcasts, and just about anywhere that you get your podcasts. Put in our show, Deborah Kobylt Live, and Dr. Connie McReynolds, and you'll find our conversation. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you. And thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.